Inside a corroded lump pulled from a 2,000-year-old shipwreck, scientists found the impossible, a machine of staggering genius, a complex computer with technology that, according to our history books, shouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. Was it proof of a lost, hyper-advanced civilization, as some claimed? Or was the truth something even more profound? What happens when a single object forces us to question everything we thought we knew about the slow, steady march of human progress? Dr. Alistair Finch tapped the lectern, a precise rhythmic gesture that punctuated the end of a sentence. Before him, a half-empty university hall drowsed in the afternoon light, the faces of his students a mixture of studious attention and screensaver vacancy. On the large display behind him, a slide depicted a clean, evolutionary line, a crude wooden gear from an ancient water wheel on the far left, transitioning through medieval clockwork, and ending with a diagram of a complex 18th century orrery. The history of technology is not a story of sudden leaps, Alistair said, his voice a calm, confident baritone that carried easily through the room. He wore a tweed jacket that was timeless rather than fashionable, his notes arranged on the lectern in a stack of almost architectural neatness. It is a story of increments, a slow, methodical climb. Each generation stands on the shoulders of the last, adding one small, logical improvement. A better alloy for the metal, a more precise way to cut a tooth. There are no missing links. There are no sudden, inexplicable quantum leaps in understanding. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a collection of grainy photos of various out-of-place artifacts. The Baghdad battery, the Dendera light. When we encounter an anomaly, our first duty as historians, as scientists, is not to invent a fantastical new past to accommodate it. It is to question our context, to dig deeper, to assume correctly that the flaw is in our understanding, not in the fundamental laws of human progress. He allowed a small, dry smile to touch his lips. It is almost never ancient aliens who built the pyramids. They simply didn't have the paperwork. We can be reasonably certain there are no divine chariots of the gods rusting away in a celestial junkyard. A few students chuckled, a polite ripple of amusement. For Alistair, this was the bedrock of reality. History was a solvable equation, a vast but ultimately logical sequence of cause and effect. There was no room for magic, for lost super-civilizations, for anything that did not have a clear, traceable provenance. The world was a complex but knowable machine, and he was one of its most dedicated mechanics. Later, in his office, the principle of order was on full display. Books on metallurgy and ancient astronomy were aligned on his shelves with military precision. Research papers were stacked in neat, color-coded folders. He was packing a worn leather briefcase, a methodical process of checking his tablet, his passport, his notes. In the background, a video played on his computer monitor. The audio muted, but the visuals shouting. It was Julian Thorne. Charismatic, handsome, in an expensive suit, Thorne stood on a brightly lit television stage, gesturing wildly. Behind him, a garish graphic swirled with images of the Giza pyramids, Stonehenge, and a flying saucer. Even without sound, the message was clear. Thorne's entire brand was built on the quantum leaps Alistair had just spent an hour debunking. He was a merchant of mystery, a peddler of the what-if. He spoke of a lost golden age, a time when humanity possessed a wisdom that mainstream science, as he called it, actively worked to suppress. Alistair watched for a moment, a frown of pure disdain tightening his features. It was intellectual poison, a rejection of rigor in favor of a comforting, dramatic fantasy. With a sharp click of his mouse, he closed the window, silencing Thorne's pantomime. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a number from Athens, he answered. Finch, the flight was a necessary evil, a turbulent interruption to his ordered world. But the summons had been insistent. And so, 24 hours later, Alistair found himself in the stark white confines of a conservation laboratory at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The air smelled of ozone and sterile cleaning agents. Across from him, the museum's director, a harried-looking man named Nikos, wrung his hands. On a steel table between them sat the reason for his journey. It was a lump, a greenish-brown, rock-like concretion about the size of a large shoebox. It was misshapen, ugly, and gave off the faint, salty tang of the deep sea. It was recovered in 1901, Nikos explained, his voice hushed with a kind of reverence, from the Antikythera shipwreck. For over a century, we assumed it was just a lump, a piece of a bronze statue, perhaps, fused with rock and sediment over 2,000 years on the seabed. Alistair leaned over the object, his eyes scanning it with practiced detachment. He saw nothing to contradict the director's assessment. It was an archaeological curiosity, but hardly unique. Standard X-rays were inconclusive, Nikos continued, but we've just installed a new prototype CT scanner, medical grade, but adapted for archaeological use, infinitely more powerful. We are testing its capabilities, and given your expertise in the history of mechanics, we hoped you might consult. Alistair nodded slowly. You think it might be a piece of a helmet, or perhaps some kind of ship's instrument, a primitive astrolabe. He was spitballing, offering the most logical, the most probable explanations. The object was a piece of the past, yes, but a known piece. It had to be. He was here to classify it, to place it neatly onto the long, incremental timeline of human invention that he knew so well. It was, he thought, a simple matter of finding the right label. Night had fallen over Athens. The museum was quiet, the ghosts of history sleeping in their glass cases. But in the imaging lab, a low, powerful hum vibrated through the floor. The CT scanner, a gleaming white donut of advanced technology, dominated the room. Alistair stood beside a young, no-nonsense engineer named Dr. Lena Petrova. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, and her focus was entirely on the vast monitor before her, which displayed a slowly rotating, three-dimensional model of the bronze lump. Alistair was fighting off a wave of jet lag and boredom. The trip felt increasingly like a waste of time. Anything yet? He asked, trying to keep the weariness from his voice. Patience, Doctor, Lena said, without looking away from the screen. Her fingers moved deftly across the keyboard. We are digitally peeling away 2 millennia of corrosion. It's not like unwrapping a birthday present. On the screen, layers of green and brown peeled away like digital onion skin. Alistair watched, his interest purely academic. Then, Lena stopped. That's odd, she muttered. A significant variation in density right here. She highlighted a section near the core of the object and magnified it. The image was still grainy, indistinct. Lena's fingers flew again, adjusting contrast, refining the data. Sharpening the focus now, she said. The image resolved. Alistair leaned closer. He blinked, certain his tired eyes were deceiving him. He felt a strange, cold sensation prickle the back of his neck. Inside the heart of the corroded lump, floating in the digital void, was a sliver of the impossible. It was a gear, a perfectly formed bronze gear wheel, its teeth fine and evenly spaced. And next to it, another, and another. A cascade of them, a complex, interlocking system of clockwork arranged with a geometric precision that was breathtakingly elegant and utterly, completely wrong. The professional calm that had defined Alistair Finch for his entire career shattered into 1,000 pieces. His mouth went dry. His carefully constructed timeline of history, the slow, logical, incremental climb he had just lectured on, evaporated in an instant. His eyes were wide, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief, staring at a 2,000-year-old machine that simply had no right to exist. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the growing graveyard of empty paper coffee cups that littered the surfaces of the imaging lab. The initial shock had burned away, replaced by a feverish, obsessive energy. Alistair and Lena worked in a bubble of shared discovery, the outside world ceasing to exist. On the main monitor, the digital ghost of the mechanism grew more complete with every passing hour. It was no longer a mere collection of gears. It was a machine. Lena, fueled by caffeine and pure intellectual curiosity, manipulated the 3D model with surgical precision. Her commentary was a stream of technical observation. Gear A7 connects to B4 with a 2.3:1 ratio, she would murmur, tracing a line of light on the screen with her mouse. The tooth count is 225 on the main drive. The tolerances are perfect. I don't know how they achieved this with hand tools. Alistair, pacing behind her, would provide the horrifying historical context. He felt like an art historian who had discovered a Rembrandt in a cave drawing. They didn't, he'd answer, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and intellectual vertigo. That gear, B4, it isn't just turning, it's mounted on another moving gear. That's a differential. That's epicyclic gearing, Lena. It's a concept that shouldn't be seen in European clockwork for another 1,000 years, at least. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. We're taught that the Greeks understood the cosmos in terms of perfect circles. This models imperfections. It accounts for anomalies. It's a level of nuance we didn't think they possessed. He was intellectually energized, his mind racing faster than it ever had. But beneath the excitement was a profound and deeply unsettling dread. Every new gear they uncovered, every intricate connection they mapped, was another nail in the coffin of his ordered, predictable history. Science was not solving the mystery, it was making it exponentially deeper. Later that night, back in the sterile anonymity of his hotel room, Alistair felt the buzz of the lab give way to a dizzying sense of isolation. He needed to talk to someone who would understand the implications. He opened his laptop and initiated a video call. A moment later, the distinguished, authoritative face of Professor Marcus Caldwell appeared on the screen. Caldwell was more than Alistair's former mentor. He was the dean of his university, a pillar of the academic establishment. "Marcus," Alistair began, unable to keep the breathless excitement from his voice. "You won't believe what we've found." He shared his screen, bringing up the initial renderings of the gear system. "It's from the Antikythera wreck. It's a machine, a complex one. The gearing is unlike anything I've ever seen from the period." He expected awe, excitement, a reflection of his own giddy disbelief. Instead, Caldwell's expression grew guarded, his brow furrowing not with wonder, but with concern. "Alistair," he said, his tone low and cautious. "Be very careful here." Alistair's excitement faltered. "Careful? Marcus, this changes everything." "It changes nothing if it ends your career," Caldwell countered, his voice firm. "You are chasing an anomaly. A fascinating one, I grant you, but an anomaly nonetheless. And the road to academic ruin is paved with fascinating anomalies. Think about it. There is no precedent, no corroborating evidence, no textual basis. If you go public with this, claiming it changes everything, you will be branded a sensationalist. You will be Julian Thorne, but with a PhD. The comparison stung. "This is nothing like Thorne," Alistair shot back. "This is evidence. This is real." "It's an outlier," Caldwell insisted. "And the establishment does not reward those who champion outliers. My advice, as your friend and your dean, is to proceed with extreme caution. Frame it as a curious but minor novelty. Write a modest paper. Do not challenge the foundational timelines. Some discoveries are too big to be made by one person. The world isn't ready, and a man's reputation is a fragile thing." The call ended, leaving Alistair staring at his own reflection in the dark screen, the thrilling certainty of his discovery now tainted with the cold poison of professional fear. The next day, Alistair learned that the world doesn't wait for peer review. As he walked through his hotel lobby, he glanced at a television screen tuned to a major news network, and there was Julian Thorne. He was in his element, a lion in the Colosseum of public opinion. And behind him, blown up on a massive screen, was a blurry but unmistakable image of the CT scan. A leak. Someone inside the museum had sent Thorne the single most important archaeological find of the century. Thorne, was electrifying. "For years, I have told you that the official story of the past is a lie," he boomed, his voice resonating with prophetic fervor. "I have told you that our ancestors possessed a wisdom, a technology that the so-called experts in their ivory towers have worked to hide from you, and now we have the proof." He gestured to the image. "They are calling it the Athens artifact. I call it vindication. A brave whistleblower, a truth-teller inside the system, has brought this to light, fighting against a dogmatic academic elite that wants to bury this discovery because it threatens their precious, outdated timelines." He leaned into the camera, his eyes burning with intensity. "They will try to downplay it. They will call it a curiosity. But do not be fooled. This is the key. This is the proof of a lost, technologically advanced civilization that they have tried so hard to erase from history. The pressure was now immense." The quiet, scholarly investigation had become a public spectacle, a battlefield in a war between science and pseudoscience. Back in the imaging lab, the atmosphere was tense. They were no longer just scientists. They were soldiers in a defensive siege, working frantically to understand their discovery before Thorne's narrative became cemented as fact. "He's running away with the story," Alistair said, the frustration raw in his voice. "We're here doing the actual work, and he's on television selling a fantasy." "Then let's give them a fact so powerful the fantasy dissolves," Lena replied, her eyes locked on the monitor. She had been working for hours on a new rendering, integrating all the smaller fragments they had mapped into a coherent whole. I think I have it. I've reconstructed the main face." She hit a final command. The wireframe model on the screen solidified. The first mini-climax had arrived. Alistair stared, his breath catching in his throat. It was an astronomical computer. Before him was a stunningly complex dial, a bronze map of the heavens. He could see the concentric circles, the intricate inscriptions marking out the Egyptian calendar and the signs of the Greek zodiac. There were pointers, now just digital reconstructions, for the sun and the moon. He could even make out markers for the 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. It was a work of staggering genius. But that wasn't the true shock. The true shock lay hidden in the gearing that drove the lunar pointer. Alistair saw it immediately, his historian's brain recognizing the theory behind the mechanics. A system of 2 gears, one riding on the back of the other, designed to do something that should have been impossible for ancient astronomy. It was built to model the moon's variable motion, its habit of speeding up as it approached perigee and slowing at apogee. They knew the moon's orbit wasn't a perfect circle, and they had invented the breathtakingly sophisticated mathematics and mechanics to model that anomaly. It was a level of theoretical and mechanical genius that was utterly, terrifyingly brilliant. This wasn't just a machine that was ahead of its time. It was a machine that seemed to come from a different world entirely. Alistair chose the path of reason. He believed, perhaps naively, that evidence, when presented clearly and rigorously to an audience of his peers, would be undeniable. He was wrong. He stood at a podium in a sterile, windowless conference room, the air cold and recirculated. The audience was a panel of the world's foremost historians of science and classical antiquity, stern, impassive faces, with his own mentor, Professor Marcus Caldwell, seated in the front row, his expression unreadable. Alistair's presentation was a model of academic restraint. He laid out the CT scan data, the gear train analysis, the astronomical implications. He avoided hyperbole, speaking in the cautious, measured tones of a scholar. "The data suggests," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room, "that certain Hellenistic artisans possessed a grasp of mechanical engineering and theoretical astronomy far exceeding our established models. The evidence points not to a deviation from the timeline, but to the possibility that our timeline itself may be incomplete." He finished, and a polite, thin smattering of applause followed. Then came the questions. They were not questions. They were scalpels. Dr. Finch, began a severe-looking woman from the University of Heidelberg, you present this mechanism as a unique artifact. With no precedent, no corroborating examples, how can you responsibly conclude anything other than that it is a novelty, perhaps even a clever forgery from a later era? The metallurgical and marine concretion data rule out a later forgery, Alistair countered. But his voice was already on the defensive. Another hand went up. You are asking us to believe that the Greeks possessed the theoretical framework for epicyclic motion centuries before Ptolemy, on the basis of one object, an object no one can physically touch or verify outside of your own digital reconstruction. It seems speculative, irresponsible even. The attacks kept coming. They questioned his methodology, his conclusions, his judgment. They picked at every seam, every assumption, their collective skepticism, a monolithic wall of resistance. Through it all, Alistair kept glancing at Caldwell, hoping for a nod of support, a word of intervention. Nothing. Caldwell sat there, a silent statue, his silence a form of judgment more damning than any hostile question. Alistair was alone, his irrefutable evidence dissolving against the acid of institutional dogma. The establishment wasn't just skeptical, it was offended. He hadn't brought them a discovery, he had brought them a heresy. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Alistair's world, once so ordered and respected, collapsed into a public relations nightmare. His failed presentation became a weapon in Julian Thorne's hands. A clip of Thorne on a late-night talk show went viral. You see, Thorne laughed, oozing smug charisma. I told you they'd do this. The so-called experts, when faced with something that shatters their little worldview, they don't get curious, they get scared. They call it a forgery, an anomaly. They attack the man who found it. The internet, with its characteristic cruelty, piled on. Memes flooded social media. Alistair's face photoshopped onto the body of a clueless professor, pointing at a diagram of a UFO. A cartoon depicted him as a stuffy academic being shown the pyramids by a grey alien, a speech bubble above his head, reading, "Remarkable, but is it peer-reviewed?" The narrative was set. Julian Thorne was the brave truth seeker, and Dr. Alistair Finch was the bumbling, dogmatic gatekeeper. The final blow came not from the public, but from his own institution. An email, formal and cold, arrived from Professor Caldwell's office. It informed him that, pending a review of the recent controversy, his research funding was being suspended. Alistair sat alone in the soulless quiet of his Athens hotel room, the screen of his laptop casting a pale glow on his face. He had presented clear evidence, and in return, the world, both the scientific world he revered and the public world he had ignored, had rejected him completely. His faith in the rational process, in the power of evidence to sway educated minds, was shattered. He was isolated, defeated, and utterly crushed. He found his way back to the museum imaging lab that night, drawn by a moth-like instinct to the source of his ruin. Lena was still there, working under the soft hum of the servers. The digital model of the mechanism rotated silently on the main screen. A beautiful, impossible ghost. "You should go home, Lena," Alistair said, his voice hollow. "This is over. They've won." Lena didn't turn around. "Who's they?" she asked, her tone flat. "The old men at the conference? The screaming man on television? They don't get to decide when the work is done. We do." "There is no more work," Alistair said, slumping into a chair. "My funding is gone. My reputation is gone. It's just an anomaly, a ghost. We can look at it forever, but we can't explain it." "I can't explain it," Lena corrected him, finally swiveling in her chair to face him. "You're the historian, but I can keep looking. While you were feeling sorry for yourself, I ran a deep-level resonance scan on the back plates. I thought I detected microscopic surface variations." She turned back to the screen and pulled up a new image, a flat grey square representing a piece of the mechanism's rear casing. It was probably nothing, just erosion, pitting from sand and seawater over the centuries. She typed a command. An algorithm began to run, enhancing the microscopic indentations, searching for patterns in the noise. But on the off chance it wasn't random, she trailed off. Lines began to appear on the screen, faint and spidery. Alistair sat up straight, his despair momentarily forgotten. He leaned forward, his heart starting to pound. They weren't random scratches. They were shapes, deliberate shapes. The algorithm finished its work, the lines resolving into sharp, clear symbols. They were Greek letters. Alistair shot to his feet, his weariness vanishing in a surge of adrenaline. "My God," he whispered, staring at the screen. "My God, Lena, they wrote on it." Just when all reason had failed, when the world had turned its back, a deeper, more patient application of the scientific tool had provided a new path. A voice, silent for 2,000 years, was beginning to speak. The hours that followed were the most intense of Alistair's life. The despair was gone, replaced by a laser-like focus. Working with Lena, they isolated every faint character, cross-referencing the archaic script with digital lexicons. It was painstaking, agonizing work. The letters were eroded, incomplete, but slowly, words and then phrases began to emerge from the digital noise. Alistair's initial assumption was that they might be dedications, perhaps the name of the owner or the maker. But the words were strange, technical, terms for cycles, for planetary positions, for numbers. Then they translated a full phrase. It read, "The sphere of the sun is driven by the 225 tooth gear." Alistair felt a shock go through him. He looked at Lena, his eyes wide. That's the main drive gear, the one you counted." He turned back to the screen, his mind racing. They weren't dedications. They were labels, descriptions. He and Lena worked faster, a frantic energy filling the lab. They translated another section, this one describing the calendar dial. Another detailed the function of a small subsidiary dial that tracked the timing of the Olympic Games. And then it hit him. The epiphany arrived like a thunderclap, a moment of searing, world-altering clarity. He had been trying to solve the wrong problem. His entire investigative approach, his fight with the establishment, his frustration, it had all been based on a flawed premise. He had been trying to prove that 1st century BC Greeks possessed the technology to build such a thing. He was fighting against the mystery of their capability, but he was wrong. The inscriptions weren't just labels, they were a user manual. The people who built this machine weren't hiding their methods. They had written them down on the machine itself. The problem wasn't a lost technology, it was a lost technical language. The builders had a vocabulary for describing these complex mechanics, a way of thinking and communicating about engineering that had vanished so completely from the historical record that it felt alien. He had been looking at the mechanism as an artifact, a silent object to be interpreted. But the manual told him how the creators themselves saw it, how they described it, how they thought. He wasn't just a historian anymore. He had to become a cryptographer, a decoder of a lost scientific soul. The key wasn't in digging for more objects, but in learning to read the one he had. The new mission transformed them. Alistair and Lena were no longer just a historian and an engineer confined to a sterile lab in Athens. They were detectives on a cold case 2 millennia old. Their journey took them south, across the Aegean Sea, to the sun-drenched island of Rhodes. They stood amidst the ruins of an ancient acropolis, the bleached stones warm under the Mediterranean sun, the air thick with the scent of wild thyme and salt. "This is where he worked," Alistair said, his voice filled with a new energy, a new purpose. He gestured to the sprawling vista of sea and sky. Hipparchus, the greatest observational astronomer of the ancient world, the inscriptions on the mechanism, the specific star catalogue it uses, the way it calculates lunar parallax. It all points to his theories. He was mapping the heavens from this very island. Lena, ever the pragmatist, shielded her eyes from the glare. "So, we're looking for his workshop? A 2,000-year-old garage with blueprints lying around?" Alistair smiled. Not quite. We're looking for a context, a school of thought. Hipparchus wasn't just one man. He was the center of a community of thinkers, astronomers, and engineers. The people who built our machine were part of that world. They shared a language, a technical vocabulary that has been lost to time. We're not looking for an object, we're looking for the ghost of an idea. They were a strange pair, the historian, now immersed in the physical world of his subjects, and the engineer, applying her logical mind to the fragmented chaos of the past. They were synthesizing their skills, applying the rigor of the lab to a real-world treasure hunt, and for the first time, Alistair felt they were on the right path. The romantic image of the quest soon gave way to the frustrating reality of historical research. Their days were spent in the dusty, silent archives of Rhodes, then Crete, then back on the mainland. The trail was maddeningly cold. They found references to Hipparchus's star maps, but the maps themselves were lost. They found mentions of complex astronomical models, but the descriptions were maddeningly vague, written by poets and philosophers, not engineers. For every step forward, they took 2 steps back into the fog of history. One afternoon, sitting in a cramped library archive, the scent of decaying paper thick in the air, the final link to Alistair's old life was severed. He opened his laptop to check a reference and saw an email from the university. It was from Professor Caldwell's office, the language cold and bureaucratic. Due to the ongoing controversy and the unsanctioned nature of your current research activities, it read, "We regret to inform you that your research funding has been officially and permanently suspended." Lena saw the look on his face. "What is it?" "It's official," Alistair said, a bitter, weary note in his voice. "I've been excommunicated from the Church of Science." He looked at the pile of books, at the travel expenses piling up. "I'm on my own now, Lena, paying for this out of my own pocket." "You should go home. There's no reason for you to be dragged down with me." Lena met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "You're not paying me to be here, Alistair. I'm here because for the first time in my life, I've seen a machine that I don't understand. As an engineer, that is an unforgivable state of affairs. I'm not leaving until we solve it." In that moment, isolated and abandoned by the establishment he had once embodied, Alistair knew he was not truly alone. His conviction, now mirrored in Lena's, was all he had left. The new lead took him to Rome. A vague reference in a fragmented shipping manifest led him to suspect a connection between the Rhodian school of astronomy and the rising power of the Roman Republic. He rented a small, 4th-floor apartment, the kind with rattling pipes and a view of 1,000 other windows. He spent his days in libraries and his nights poring over digital copies of texts from the Vatican archives, a lonely scholar chasing a ghost through the labyrinth of history. He was exhausted, running on fumes and dwindling savings when he found it. It wasn't in a grand, famous work. It was in a fragment from a lesser-known text by Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great Roman statesman and orator. Alistair's eyes, sore from hours of reading ancient script, widened. His blood ran cold. In the text, Cicero described a visit to the home of his friend Posidonius, a renowned philosopher and astronomer from Rhodes. Alistair read the translated words, his heart pounding against his ribs. "And Posidonius has recently fashioned a sphere," Cicero wrote, "which in its revolutions shows the movements of the sun and moon and the 5 wandering stars, which brings about in a single revolution the same motions as the heavens do in a day and a night." He continued reading, his hands trembling. Cicero went on to describe how the device correctly showed eclipses and the irregular orbit of the moon. It wasn't a similar device. It wasn't a vague reference. It was a clear, contemporary, eyewitness description of the exact same kind of object. A direct link between the anonymous mechanism and a known historical figure, a specific school of thought, and a specific place. He had it, the corroborating evidence, the Rosetta Stone that connected the hard, empirical data from the machine to the soft, textual evidence of history. It was a moment of pure, triumphant synthesis. Frantically, Alistair opened his email, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he typed a message to Lena. "I've found it," he wrote. "Cicero, he saw one. Posidonius built it." He was about to hit send when a notification popped up on the side of his screen. A news alert. The headline was a gut punch. "Live now. Thorne expedition finds sister device to Athens artifact." Alistair's blood froze. He clicked the link. A live video feed filled his screen. It showed Julian Thorne standing on the deck of a high-tech salvage boat at dusk, the sea churning behind him. He was incandescent with triumph. In his hands, he held up another corroded, lumpy object, remarkably similar to the one Alistair had first seen in Athens. "We have found it," Thorne declared to the camera, his voice booming with authority. "For months, the academic elites have tried to dismiss our evidence. But here, recovered from a previously unknown wreck off the coast of Spain, is the final, irrefutable proof. Another example of this lost hyper-advanced technology. This is not Greek. This is not Roman. This is the legacy of a global Golden Age civilization that they have tried to bury." Alistair stared at the screen in horror. Just as he had found the key, the one piece of evidence that could prove the mechanism's human origin, his antagonist had made a move that could eclipse his discovery entirely. Thorne's spectacle, broadcast live to the world, threatened to cement the fantasy as fact, rendering Alistair's slow, methodical, and now proven research utterly irrelevant. The race between science and superstition had become literal, and the showman was about to cross the finish line. Thorne's triumphant face on the screen was a declaration of war. For Alistair, the time for quiet research was over. He and Lena flew back to Athens, a frantic energy crackling between them. They were no longer just scholars. They were soldiers in a race against a lie that was halfway around the world before the truth had even gotten its boots on. They returned to the imaging lab, their sanctuary, and now their command center. "He's selling a story," Alistair said, his voice sharp and clear, all traces of academic weariness gone. "We have to tell a better one, a true one." They worked furiously. The Cicero text was their Rosetta Stone, the Inscriptions their guide. They were no longer just reconstructing a static object. They were building its virtual twin, a fully functional digital simulation. Alistair, armed with his newfound historical context, guided Lena's technical genius. "The lunar gearing," he'd call out, reading from his notes. "Posidonius used a pin and slot mechanism to model the first anomaly. Can you replicate that?" Lena's fingers would fly across the keyboard. "Pin and slot implemented. Now what about the metonic cycle? The inscriptions say it's on a 235-tooth gear. Inputting now," she'd confirm. One by one, they brought the ghost in the machine to life. They input the gear ratios, the calendar functions, the planetary cycles. Finally, after hours of relentless work, Lena leaned back. "That's it," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Every known function is integrated. Let's run it." Alistair nodded. "Set the start date, August 12th, 128 BC. "Why that date?" Lena asked. "A total solar eclipse was visible from Rhodes on that day," Alistair replied. "Let's see if our machine knows that." Lena initiated the simulation. On the screen, the digital model whirred to life. Gears of gold and bronze turned in perfect, complex harmony. Pointers for the sun and moon began to move across the zodiacal dial, sweeping through the years. They watched, mesmerized, as the date counter flew forward. As it approached 128 BC, the sun pointer and the moon pointer began to converge. On the precise date, they aligned perfectly, one eclipsing the other. The machine flawlessly predicted the ancient eclipse. They hadn't just rebuilt it, they understood it. They had armed themselves with the ultimate weapon, demonstrable, undeniable truth. The university auditorium was packed to the rafters with journalists, cameras, and the curious public. It was Thorne's victory lap, and he was a master of ceremonies at the height of his powers. He stood on stage, bathed in spotlights, a figure of supreme confidence. "For too long," he proclaimed, his voice resonating with theatrical passion, "we have been told a small, timid story about our past, a story of slow, plodding progress. But I am here to tell you that our ancestors were not timid. They were giants. With a grand flourish, he unveiled his find. It sat on a velvet pedestal, a lump of corroded bronze. It was vaguely gear-shaped, but indistinct, inconclusive. An archaeologist's inkblot test. Thorne, however, used its ambiguity as a strength. "The experts will tell you this is nothing," he sneered. "They will demand to see every tooth, every gear, but they miss the big picture. This artifact, found thousands of miles from the first, proves that this knowledge was global. It is the legacy of a seafaring super-civilization, the kind spoken of in our oldest myths." He weaved a grand narrative of Atlantis, of lost wisdom, of a golden age. He was selling a feeling, a sense of wonder, and the crowd was buying every word. In the back of the auditorium, Professor Marcus Caldwell watched, his arms crossed, a deeply uneasy expression on his face. Thorne finished to thunderous applause. "I will now take a few questions," he said, beaming. A hand went up in the middle of the room. A microphone was passed. "Dr. Thorne," a journalist began, but was cut off by a calm, clear voice from the aisle. "Actually, the question is for you," Alistair said, stepping up to a second microphone. He was no longer the cautious, tweed-clad academic. He stood tall, his voice steady, and filled with a new, quiet authority. Thorne's smile tightened. "Dr. Finch, I see the establishment has sent its designated debunker." "No," Alistair replied calmly. "I'm not here to debunk. I'm here to present a competing theory." Before Thorne could object or have him removed, Alistair turned to the tech booth. "Now, please." The massive screen behind Thorne flickered, and his image was replaced by something breathtaking. It was the virtual twin of the Antikythera Mechanism, photorealistic, gleaming, and fully animated. The digital model rotated in stunning 3D. A universe in a box. The intricate dance of its gears, the perfect alignment of its pointers, the sheer undeniable reality of it filled the auditorium. A collective gasp went through the room. Thorne was momentarily silenced. Alistair seized the moment. For months, this debate has been framed as a choice between a boring, accepted history and a fantastic, unproven one, he began, his voice commanding the room's attention. That is a false choice. The truth is more wondrous than any fantasy. He walked the audience through the mechanism, his words painting a vivid picture. "This isn't alien technology," he said, as the model on the screen turned to show the rear dials, "because its creators left us their names, not in alien script, but in Greek." He quoted the Inscriptions, the words of the makers themselves, describing the cycles of the sun and moon. And this machine wasn't found in isolation. The great Roman statesman Cicero saw one just like it. He tells us it was built by a man named Posidonius, a brilliant astronomer working on the island of Rhodes. He didn't attack Thorne's theory, he simply replaced it. He replaced the empty fantasy of a super-civilization with the rich, detailed, and true story of Hipparchus, of Posidonius, of a community of human geniuses who reached for the heavens with minds and hands and bronze. He wasn't just presenting data, he was telling the story of the people who created it. He had reclaimed the wonder. The press was captivated, their cameras now fixed on Alistair and the functioning universe on the screen. Julian Thorne stood speechless on the stage, his ambiguous rock now looking like what it was, a pathetic, meaningless lump. In the back of the room, a slow, deliberate sound cut through the silence. It was Professor Caldwell. He was on his feet and he was applauding. First one person joined him, then another, until the entire auditorium, minus one man on stage, was filled with the sound of thunderous applause. Not for a fantasy, but for a truth that was finally, beautifully told. It's fascinating how a single object, a collection of gears from the ancient world, can become a battleground for two opposing ways of seeing the past. On one side, you have the Julian Thorne narrative, a grand, sweeping fantasy of a lost golden age, of a global super-civilization. It's an incredibly seductive idea, isn't it? It suggests our history is more magical than we imagine, that we've lost some profound wisdom. It's a simple, powerful story. But the story of Alistair Finch shows us something more complex. His initial approach, pure data and academic rigor, failed to capture the public's imagination. He had the facts, but Thorne had the better story. Alistair only won when he realized he had to reclaim the wonder. He had to replace the empty fantasy of Atlantis with the very real, very human story of brilliant astronomers on a Greek island, using their minds and hands to build a universe in a box. The truth wasn't just a set of gear ratios, it was a testament to human genius. It forces us to ask what we truly seek from the past. Is it the comfort of a simple fantasy, or the more complex, challenging, but perhaps more profound wonder of what real people were capable of? Which story do you find more awe-inspiring? A gift from a mythical super race, or the staggering, almost unbelievable achievement of our own ancestors?